So in one of my previous videos, I went over one of the craziest methods a lot of the top leaderboard players are using to get the absolute strongest possible weapons you can get, which in this case specifically means getting gem strength rolls on your weapons, which will just give you absurdly high multiplicative damage increases. And there is a specific method that takes a very small amount of resources to roll as many weapons as possible to get this gem strength roll. And while that method is incredibly cheap on materials, the main thing that's holding you back from getting the weapons you're looking for is just getting more actual weapons to roll. So in this video, I want to go over how to get the most amount of weapons to try to get gem strength rolls on them. Now, I think I should give a quick TLDR of this gem strength rolling method, but I would recommend checking out my previous video that goes over this to go into more details. Now, the quickest TLDR is that when you transfigure a weapon, you can get a gem strength roll on it, which will increase how much damage multiplier you get from your gems, because gems in weapons give a damage multiplier. This means you could be getting gems that potentially give you like 140 plus damage multiplier per gem if you get the correct roll. But if you were doing what you would normally be doing on gear, you would be going through, you would be fully modifying your item, you would be upgrading it, masterworking it, doing all of that, and that takes a ridiculous amount of resources before you even get to the transfigure. And this also means you probably weren't doing it on all the ancestral weapons you come across. But because of some of the rare rolls you can get on transfigure, you don't want to be doing any of that. Essentially what you want to be doing is any ancestral weapon you come across, you want to transfigure first, because just transfiguring a weapon is very, very cheap. It costs almost nothing. But what you're actually looking for is to transfigure your weapon and it gets the gem strength roll on it, but it also doesn't make the weapon unmodifiable, because anytime you transfigure an item, there is a small chance that it does not make it unmodifiable. So you're looking for this like 1 in 500 roll on these weapons that will give your weapon the gem strength percent increase and also not make it unmodifiable. So then you would have a weapon that you haven't modified at all with a gem strength roll on it that then you could go fully modify. You could go put the aspects on it, you could go temper it, you could go masterwork it. And another really big upside of using this method is that when you go back and masterwork it, you can actually hit the greater affix roll from your masterwork on the gem strength roll as well, which will just massively increase the amount of multiplier you get from your gems. Now that's the quickest and easiest TLDR I can give you on this method. I'd recommend checking out my video if you want a more detailed explanation of why this is so good. But that brings us to the question, how to farm enough weapons to actually get that roll, since it's like a 1 in 500 chance. And just to get it out of the way, if you're using a unique weapon, the specific method in this video basically doesn't work. If you're using a unique weapon in your build, you basically just have to go farm the boss and try to get unique weapons that aren't horribly rolled to do this method on. But I would say more builds in the game are not using unique weapons. So if you're using legendary weapons, getting gem strength on them is significantly more easy just because you could farm so many more non-unique weapons. And there's actually two methods I'm going to be going over in this video. One that I don't think a lot of people realize even exists, and the other pretty much everybody's probably heard about. Now, the first one is a method I don't think a lot of people have heard of, and this is just because we're further into the season, so the resources used to craft the weapons, you're probably going to have a lot more of. Now, if you go to any blacksmith, there is actually a weapon crafting tab where you can craft weapons or armor of different rarities. This is also where you go and craft the random mythic box, and you'll see different tabs to craft magic or rare weapons. And these crafts will take some amount of base salvaging materials. So if you want to craft a magic weapon, specifically let's say two-handed weapons to make it easy, to craft a two-handed magic weapon, it's 100 iron chunks and 20 forgotten souls. If you want to craft a rare two-handed weapon, it's 100 iron chunks, 40 veiled crystals, which is what you'll have the most of, and 40 forgotten souls. Now you can craft either of these. specifically because iron chunks is actually the thing you'll probably run out of first doing this method, because even if you have a lot less Forgotten Souls, you can actually turn Veiled Crystals into Forgotten Souls, and Veiled Crystals you probably have a lot more of than anything else. So realistically, iron chunks may be the thing that limits you the most using this method, but I would actually recommend you craft magic weapons. And the reason for that is because you could take a magic weapon and with very minimal investment, you can turn it into a legendary in the Haradra Cube. So what you would essentially do, you would go to the blacksmith, you would craft a bunch of whatever weapon you're looking for. If it's a 200 weapon, like I mentioned, it would take 100 iron chunks, 20 Forgotten Souls per weapon. I could currently craft like 1,000 or 1,200, something like that, two-handed magic weapons. I could legitimately use my resources and just go through 1,200 weapons, and I would more than likely get a handful of weapons with the rolls we want. The gem strength with the weapons still being modifiable. So you're going to craft a bunch of these magic weapons, you're going to take them to the Haradra Cube, and you're going to add affixes to them to get them up to rarity. So it's going to need 3 affixes, and when you craft these magic items, they will randomly have either 1 or 2 affixes. And it's very, very cheap to add affixes to pretty much any item. You'll probably have a ridiculous amount of the resources. I think I have enough resources to add like 20,000 affixes to items, so I'm pretty much never going to run out of the materials to do that. And then once that item turns into a rare item, so it has 3 affixes, you're going to go down and you're going to upgrade it to legendary through the Haradra Cube. Don't go put an affix on the item, which will also turn it into a legendary. Upgrade it to a legendary through the Haradra Cube, because again, that will take materials that you probably have a ridiculous amount of just because they're so plentiful. And then once you've upgraded that weapon to a legendary, you are then going to transfigure it. Like I mentioned previously, make sure these are ancestral weapons. Any weapons you craft or any weapons you get through anything, if it's not ancestral, throw it away. Because having a weapon that's 50 item power lower is just a massive reduction in your overall base damage. So only do this with ancestral weapons. But because gem strength is so strong, you don't have to do this with just greater affix items. Do it with literally any ancestral item you come across. Because let's say you craft this magic item, turn it into a legendary, and it has super bad stats on it, but then you go transfigure it and you get the rolls we're talking about. You get a gem strength roll and your weapon is still modifiable. Well, on a non-unique item, you can now go do all the rolling you want in the cube to get the stats you want. Then you can add the affix you want, you can add the gem slots, you can go temper it and masterwork it. You can do all of that and get all the stats you want after you get the gem strength roll. With the main reason for doing this being that it's incredibly cheap to do this method I'm going over. You probably have enough resources to do this with like 1,000 or more weapons. So at some point you are going to come across a roll we're talking about, and you will have not spent a ton of resources doing that. So that is the first method of getting a ridiculous amount of weapons. Crafting the magic weapons from the blacksmith, adding affixes to them until they're of a rarity at the cube, upgrading them to legendary at the cube, and then transfiguring them at the cube and hoping to get a gem strength roll without the weapon being unmodifiable. And the second method is going to be something you've probably heard of or done yourself, and that is Obol farming. And this is specifically going to be done through nightmare dungeons, and more specifically done through escalation nightmare sigils. Because if you don't know, pretty much any positive affix you can get in a nightmare dungeon is going to be better if you do it through an escalation sigil. And specifically, you're looking for the Obol's reserve affix on nightmare dungeon sigils. So let's say you have a normal nightmare dungeon sigil, it has an Obol's reserve on it, or you have an escalation nightmare dungeon sigil with Obol's on it. That escalation dungeon nightmare sigil will just give you more Obol's per chest than the normal nightmare dungeon sigil does. So pretty much never run normal nightmare dungeon sigils, always run escalation dungeons. Now on top of that, as you progress through the 3 dungeons in your escalation sigil run, the affixes actually get stronger with each stage. So let's say you have an escalation sigil that you got lucky and every stage you got the Obol affix on it. Well, the first dungeon you do will give you a good amount of Obols out of a chest. Once you get to the end, defeat the boss, and you go through the portal to the second dungeon, if you get Obols in that, it'll give even more Obols out of every chest than the first dungeon did, and same for the third. And if you get the Obol's reserve affix on the third dungeon of the escalation nightmare sigil, that will be giving you around 1,000 Obols, maybe even more per chest. So if you do that and you add up all of the chests, which there are usually close to a dozen chests, maybe even more sometimes, in that one dungeon, and then you also kill the boss at the end, which will then drop you a ton more obols, you will legitimately be getting probably close to like 20,000 obols in that run. Now you will have to go back to town constantly just because of how much obols you get per chest, but even though that's kind of tedious, that's a good thing because you go back to town, and even if you're gambling for 200 weapons, that is still a full inventory of 200 weapons you just gambled for every single time you come back to town. And once you use all of your obols on weapons, you're just going to keep every ancestral weapon, no matter what rarity it is. Now, I personally don't keep the white rarity just because I'm not trying to spam the add affix that many times, but I keep magic, rare, or legendary ancestral weapons. I salvage all of the other weapons, and then I go transfigure on all of those weapons right away. And again, if you ever get that god tier roll, you're good to go, and you now have a weapon that's ungodly strong compared to anything else you could conceivably get. Now, on top of this, for me personally, if I get a weapon that is very well rolled at a baseline, I will still take that weapon through all of the upgrading before I transfigure it. Because if I get like a 3 GA weapon that has all the GAs on the stats I want, that weapon is good enough that even if you don't get gem strength on it, that's probably a weapon you may want to use in the future. So for weapons that are that well rolled, I still do the normal method of fully upgrading it before transfiguring, but anything besides a very well rolled base weapon, just transfigure it right away. But that's pretty much the two best methods currently in Diablo 4 to just get as many ancestral weapons as you possibly can. And again, all of these methods are quite cheap to do. Like I mentioned, just going and transfiguring a weapon you get is very cheap, but even adding in the affixes and upgrading the weapon to legendary to then transfigure is also pretty cheap. Even if you're using your salvage materials to craft from the blacksmith, that is still pretty cheap. Like I mentioned, I can craft like 1,200 two-handed magic weapons right now. And even though I think most players probably won't have that many salvage materials, most players will still probably be able to craft a few hundred. And also on top of that, if you're running low on salvage materials, what you can do is just disable your loot filter and legitimately go do some runs of like random nightmare dungeons and just loot every item you come across. Go back to town, salvage it. You can build up these salvage materials quite quickly using that method if you're really running low. And also, if you're running low on things like Forgotten Souls, you can go run nightmare dungeons, specifically escalation nightmare sigils with the material reserve affix on it, which when you go open any of the newly spawning chests in the nightmare dungeon, it will drop a ton of materials. This will both include salvage materials, so things like Forgotten Souls, and it will also include quite a lot of the new cube crafting materials. So if you're running low on those, you're also going to be running nightmare dungeons with the materials reserve affix on it. And that's one of the affixes that if you're running an escalation sigil, and let's say you get material reserve on the final, the 3 dungeons, it will give more materials out of it. And you can start to get like upwards of 100 Forgotten Souls per chest if you get that roll I just talked about. So you have a lot of ways to farm the materials you need to do this, and it's quite cheap in general to just transfigure any ancestral item you get. And then once you get that god roll, you are legitimately going to be upping your damage by like a couple 100%. So it is ridiculously OP, and these are the best ways to farm the weapons to then go transfigure them. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.